One of the most infamous houses in KeyForge is the Call of the Archons iteration of House Shadows. Shadow's primary theme was Ember control through the method of stealing, an extraordinarily potent mechanic to the point that certain cards required an errata. They also dealt a lot of pesky direct damage, which could then combo into more stealing. Keeping with the theme of stealth and thievery, Shadow's creatures across the board were all very small, typically 3 or less power, and usually having elusive. But there was one creature that broke all these rules. A creature that didn't seem to follow any pattern previously established by the roles Shadows played, and possessed an ability that couldn't be assimilated with anything else in the game. The card was only ever printed once in Call of the Archons, and we haven't seen it since. This creature is Shadow Self, one of the oddest cards ever printed to date, and in today's video we will be very closely analyzing it, its weird interactions with other cards, and the plethora of rules questions it brings up during gameplay. This is Shadow Self Explained. First off, Shadow Self is 9 power. 9 power in a house full of tiny creatures, and that makes it a blaring exception right from the start. It reads, Shadow Self deals no damage when fighting. Damage dealt to non-specter neighbors is dealt to Shadow Self instead. So Shadow Self is meant to be used as creature protection, being placed next to creatures you want to keep safe. One of the things that's weird about this effect, though, is that it's like a weird version of Taunt. With Taunt, you can only fight into the creature that has Taunt, not either of its neighbors unless they also have Taunt. However, with Shadow Self, you can still fight into Shadow Self's neighbors, but all the damage dealt to the neighbor from the fight will be dealt to Shadow Self instead, as long as they don't have the Spectre trait. Ultimately, it makes it pretty much pointless to fight into Shadow Self's neighbors. You may as well just fight into Shadow Self at that point. Another difference between Taunt and Shadow Self is that Shadow Self guards its neighbors against all damage, whereas Taunt only protects its neighbors from being fought into. You can still deal direct damage to the creatures being guarded by Taunt using cards like Nerve Blast, Rock Hurling Giant, Festering Touch, or Mother Gun. Shadow Self, on the other hand, protects against all damage. Fight damage goes to Shadow Self, as does direct damage. This can make it really tough to get rid of even a small Hunting Witch that's protected by Shadow Self, since you practically have to deal 11 total damage, 9 to Shadow Self and 2 to finish off the Hunting Witch. Once you start boosting up Shadow Self with even more power using cards like Blood of Titans, it can become a massive pain to deal with. But notice that Shadow Self only protects against fight damage and direct damage. It does not protect against things like direct removal. Cards like Implosion, which straight up destroy a creature, or Fear, which put creatures back in hand, are still fully effective against Shadow Self's neighbors. Tempting Offer, Bouncing Death Quirk, Oubliette, and Destroy Them All can still deal with creatures protected by Shadow Self. Putting Pain Mail on one of these said creatures would also be an interesting way of dealing with it. However, there's one exception to this whole damage rule that Shadow Self creates, and it shows up in the card Entropic Manipulator. It's a rare Mars card that reads, Choose a player. You may redistribute the damage on the creatures that player controls among that player's creatures. You may cause more damage to a creature than it has power. This is a one-of-a-kind way to get around Shadow Self in a method that involves damage, since you're technically not dealing damage, but rather redistributing damage that's already there. Or, as the phrase in parentheses puts it, causing damage. So you can redistribute, to cause damage to the creatures protected by Shadow Self, to the point of potentially even destroying them. It's a very niche interaction, but an interesting one nonetheless. How does Poison factor in? If a creature with Poison attacks a neighbor of Shadow Self would die, because any damage dealt by the power of the creature with Poison kills the attacked creature. And in this case, with the damage being redirected to Shadow Self would die. Another point to bring up is that armor factors into the equation when calculating how much damage Shadow Self takes. How does that work exactly? Well, the timing window when armor is involved is actually kind of strange. Let's set up a scenario where Bulwark is next to Shadow Self, giving Shadow Self 2 extra armor. A 5 power creature then fights into Bulwark. First, 2 of the damage is prevented by Bulwark's armor. Once the 3 remaining damage is redirected to Shadow Self, the timing window for armor to prevent damage has already passed, meaning Shadow Self will still take the full remaining 3 damage, rendering the 2 armor provided to it by Bulwark useless. If that seems weird to you, I'm totally with you, it seems weird to me too, but that's what FFG says would happen. Giving Shadow Self extra armor doesn't seem to do much unless you fight directly into Shadow Self. Shadow Self really has to be the direct target of the attack for things like armor or ward to come into effect. Wait a minute, you might be asking. Did you just say wards as well? Yep, the redirected damage gets behind wards as well. Just as the timing window passes for armor on Shadow Self during a fight into one of its neighbors, the window passes for wards too, and the damage will get behind the ward without it being popped. But in the event that the redirected damage goes above 9, above Shadow Self's 9 power, Shadow Self will get destroyed and the ward will pop to prevent the destruction. However, since Shadow Self still has 9 or more damage on it, it will die anyway as a result. Yeah, really weird stuff, and I don't know when a Shadow Self would ever end up warded since it's a Coda card, but FFG has confirmed it to be the case. The more you analyze Shadow Self, the less useful it seems to become, honestly. Elusive still functions regularly. Fighting into an elusive neighbor of Shadow Self will still result in no damage being dealt to anybody, not to the attacking creature, not to the victim of the attack, nor to Shadow Self. Any assault damage is still redirected to Shadow Self. And of course, if you have 2 Shadow Selves next to each other, you can obviously fight into one Shadow Self without the damage being redirected to the other Shadow Self, since its text specifies non-Spectre neighbors. Funnily enough, Shoulder Id, one of the only other Spectres in the game, happens to be just as confusing as Shadow Self much of the time, if not more so. Maybe I'll make a video on him next time. But that's all I've got for today. I thought it could be interesting to analyze one of the oddest creatures in KeyForge and explore some of the weird interactions it has with other cards. And if you're a newer player, hopefully this video helped you out a little bit. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on Shadow Self as a card, and if there are any interactions I missed. Thank you all so much for watching, and I can't wait to see you all again in the next one. See you later.